Welcome to the second event in the British Academy's Future of the Corporation Purpose Summit. I'm Victoria Hurth, a visiting fellow of Cambridge University's Judge Business School, and in today's session, we'll be focusing on pinpointing the role of stakeholders in purposeful businesses and what the practical changes, what are those that can be made in terms of governance to bring this about. We have an incredible panel of speakers to help us move to greater consensus about this. This is a topic very close to my heart and to my work. In my capacity over the past 4 years as a convener of what will be the first global ISO international standard, providing guidance on the governance of organizations, it'll be called ISO 37000. The role of stakeholders has been an absolutely core discussion point for the 54 countries and 20+ liaisons that have been involved. For me, purpose and the British Academy's principles of purposeful business are part of a watershed moment in economic history. Stripped down, the economy and sustainability share the same overarching purpose: to ensure well-being for all life on Earth over the longer term. For too long, we have held faith that an arm's length commercial market of exchange can deliver well-being automatically. As long as companies give consumers what they desire, governments keep a low profile, and executives constrain their self-interest and focus on capturing as much financial value to serve the self-interest of often arm's-length investors. It's clear that we cannot hold this faith anymore. The automatic production of sustainable well-being for all is not happening. The data is clear. From climate change to the ecological crisis to inequality, sustainable and equitable well-being is in crisis now. Bringing about a system of purposeful organizations in direct service of society is, for me, the most promising market-based adjustment to capitalism that can achieve the economic goal of long-term well-being. And it does this by internalizing the delivery of well-being outcomes into the core objective of a company, as its very reason to exist. A shift at the heart of an organization's identity, which purpose is, lands first and foremost with the governing body. And the question of what needs to change in terms of how the governing body considers the role of stakeholders in this, be that as the object of the purpose or the basis of delivery, is therefore a central question. And when the perceived reality is that a company's job is to maximize profits in a system of competing self-interest, stakeholders, I've found, tend to be seen as the other, a risk to shareholders getting the maximum share of the pie. Diversity can become just a mere risk management tool to retain the license to operate. This way of seeing the world is often the case, I found, even with a long-term shareholder value perspective. However, when a company starts to become purpose-driven, I observe that stakeholders tend to move from being seen as a tool in a process to being either the point of the company I see in my research around purpose is a humble recognition that stakeholders are the key source of wisdom regarding how to deliver value, particularly in 3 areas. Firstly, what the world needs you to do as your purpose. In other words, which problems of long-term well-being for all are you going to fix profitably? Secondly, how should you achieve it? And finally, how to move beyond trade-offs to win-wins. With this paradigm shift, having real diversity on boards, which has obviously come to the fore in recent moments, and having diversity in the company, as well as true accountability, become not just the morally right thing to do, but the only way to make sure that a company is truly valuable and living its purpose. These are deep paradigmatic and cultural shifts, and hence important and difficult to achieve. We need to start quickly pinpointing what changes to governance need to be made in order to create and sustain a new normal when it comes to stakeholders. I very much look forward to hearing the views of our exceptional panelists today on how they see the role of stakeholders in a purposeful business and what they assess needs to change in the culture, systems, and law surrounding governance to bring this about. During the session, we have a Slido app which you'll see below the live stream on your webpage. And here you can propose questions that we'll be covering at the end in our short Q&A session. So please do put forward your questions and vote for your favorites, and that will make for an interactive session. And in something I haven't seen online before, there will also be an illustrator creating visuals of the discussion as we go below the Slido app. And maybe this will also double up as a nice Christmas present that we can buy, but I will have to check if that's possible. Finally, please don't forget to join and contribute to the LinkedIn group. You will have been sent this link, or you can search for it. So I'll now move to our first speaker, who is Professor Colin Mayer. He is the academic lead for the Future of the Corporation initiative. Colin has spearheaded the work since it started 3 years ago. And as an academic myself who feels that research should be in service of the critical problems of society, Colin epitomizes how this should be done properly. So Colin, over to you.
Victoria, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. In yesterday's session, we looked at the core principles that underlie the Future of the Corporation programme. And the main one is the notion of corporate purpose. We noted that the programme has defined corporate purpose as being to solve the problems we face as people and planet, and to do so in a form that is profitable and commercial, to produce profitable solutions to the problems of people and planet, and not to profit from producing problems for either. The first session emphasised the importance of corporate purposes as meaningful challenges for companies in terms of addressing global issues. Secondly, the potential for purposeful business to make a substantial contribution to solving the problems we face. Thirdly, the need to convert those challenges into products and business models that deliver solutions to global problems in profitable, commercially viable, and sustainable ways. And finally, the need to work with government in recognizing the social licenses that business will be expected to fulfill, and the importance of government defining these and assisting companies in delivering them. The Future of the Corporation programme has put forward a set of 8 principles to promote purposeful businesses around law and regulation, ownership and governance, measurement and performance, and finance and investment. In this session, as Victoria said, we focus on governance, corporate governance, and pose the question, what are the corporate governance arrangements that will be best suited to delivering meaningful changes and positive societal outcomes? The UK has recently had a significant change in its corporate governance code, shifting away from the traditional emphasis on the agency problem of aligning managerial interests with those of their shareholders to a focus on the role of the board in determining and embedding its corporate purpose. What does it mean to embed corporate purpose in practice? We will address this from the perspective of different stakeholders to the firm: workers, societies, shareholders, and boards, and the environment. In other words, we will cover all aspects of ESG, where the E, as some people have suggested, might refer to employees, as well as the environment, and the grounds that they are arguably the most important stakeholder in a firm. What we are interested in establishing are the meaningful changes in governance that will give real force to corporate purpose as a way of solving problems for all stakeholders. What evidence can we draw on from different sectors, countries, and types of governance arrangements? And with that question, I'll hand it back to you, Victoria, to start the session.
Thank you, Colin. And we now move to Frances O'Grady, who is General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, or otherwise known as TUC. Thank you, Frances.
Thanks very much, Victoria, and hello to everybody watching in. I think I would start by saying that this pandemic has made us question everything. It's exposed deep inequalities in society and in the economy. And I think many people are now much clearer about who has really kept Britain going through this crisis, and why it is that some of the most important jobs in society are paid the least. But I think there is this new mood of shareholders or what goes on in the boardroom, actually workers really matter too. I think I would also reflect that we've seen a different attitude towards institutions. Famously, I think we've seen the Bank of England and indeed institutions like the BBC have stepped up, and I think people are maybe remembering their value too. But I would argue that's also the case for trade unions, including unions having to step up out of our comfort zone. Some of you may remember that it was unions that led that call for manufacturers to shift production into delivering personal protective equipment and ventilators. That was union-led, working together with companies to do that. So that question of the value of voice in decision-making and who gets a voice feels really pertinent. And of course, we do that through collective bargaining, and we can show how collective bargaining as a system can also help companies come to a speedier delivery of objectives where we can agree what those should be. We've also done it strategically, and I think people again are aware that the TUC played a big role in the development and implementation of the job retention scheme and the self-employed income support scheme, which together have helped over 11 million workers. We've also been involved in safe return guidelines. And I guess the key lesson is that no company is an island. The safety within any individual organisation is important, not just for the workforce, but for public transport workers, for families, for communities in the wider economy, because the speediest way to reopen the economy is to do so safely through building an agreement with stakeholders. So there's been that rediscovery of collectivism, of interdependence, and the value of having a variety of voices in the room. In the past, I think there's been a big focus on the importance of more women in the boardroom, more Black and ethnic minority people in the boardroom. We are making the case that in addition, we need to hear more workers' voices in the boardroom. What does this mean for corporate governance? Well, of course, Theresa May famously promised that she would introduce worker representation in the boardroom. I think, if we're honest, there was a fair bit of corporate lobbying against that, and that promise didn't come to fruition. But I would argue that the case still holds good. The majority of European countries have workers in the boardroom in some form. The TUC is arguing for a third, and we recognise that we are flexible about whether that's for a unitary model or a two-tier model. Both or either is fine with us. What we're focused on is the evidence that bringing that constructive challenge into the workforce has been shown to improve, to tend to steer decision-making towards longer-term investment, a focus on longer-term issues like skills, fairness, and of course the environment too. We also want to see some reform of directors' duties so that there is a bigger focus on the long-term success of companies rather than short-termism. And we would also like to limit the influence of very short-term shareholders by having, for example, a 2-year qualification period for voting. I think my main conclusion, and I'll finish with this, Victoria, is that our very strong sense in the trade union movement, representing 6 million workers and of course growing, is that we cannot go back to business as usual, that we face, even if this pandemic is beaten quickly and we don't see a resurgence, we've got other massive challenges that we face, from technology to climate to inequality. And in order to face and address those challenges, we are going to have to be prepared not only to tackle those deep inequalities, but to share power. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frances, for those insightful thoughts and emphasising that need to move beyond business as usual. And we now move to Dan Labbad, who is CEO of the Crown Estate. Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Frances. And I agree with a lot of what Frances outlined. Since December last year, I've been the Chief Executive at the Crown Estate, a business set up by Parliament to manage assets on behalf of the monarch and the nation, the latter of which, via the UK Treasury, has been the ultimate beneficiary of our profit, which has totalled about £2.8 billion over the last 10 years. I joined the business because of its enormous potential to be truly purpose-led. So I'm really pleased to be here and part of this conversation today. When I was offered the job, dealing with the impact of a global pandemic wasn't what I expected in my first 6 months. And I don't want to spend a lot of time today on COVID, but its effects, as Frances has said, has reinforced the importance of stakeholders in purposeful business, I think, like never before. The crisis has left no part of society unaffected, underlying the idea that our biggest challenges and their solutions are collective ones, and that no person, and again, as Frances has said, or organisation is an island. While the impact of COVID was felt quickly and acutely across the world, challenges like climate change, systemic inequalities, discrimination, as we've learnt all too well in recent times, just to name a few, are equally challenging and just as pressing. Purpose as an overarching guide for strategy is one of the most powerful tools a business has to build meaningful partnerships with stakeholders, to show where it can add value, not just extract and contribute positively to society's challenges. Business can no longer keep its head down on the big issues, focus where maximum profit will come from, and still expect to succeed in isolation. And whilst we can't change the world alone, we must play our part in moving things in the right direction. This requires humble yet courageous leadership, not just from government and communities, but also from business. For a business to truly lead, in my opinion, it needs a North Star, it needs a purpose that reflects its reason for being, guides decisions, and ultimately legitimises its existence. That North Star, I think, comes about by asking yourself three questions. One, what do you as a business have to offer given your unique attributes and your capabilities? How does that align with what the world needs, including and in particular your stakeholders? And how do you create value by operating at the intersection between those first two questions in order to extract value? Before moving on, I'll briefly spend a little bit more time on the Crown Estate in a bit more detail. We're at the beginning of this journey ourselves, so I also come at this question from a very humble position. We date back to 1760, and today we're a £14 billion business with assets including the nation's seabed, which we're custodians over, which we lease for things like offshore wind and infrastructure. Windsor Great Park, significant property portfolio in the West End, including Regent Street and a large part of St James. And we have a commercial and rural portfolio across the country. Like all companies, we have a diverse and dynamic set of stakeholders. And alongside Treasury and the Monarch, this includes our people, global investment partners, as well as local, our supply chain, and thousands of customers and communities across the country. And finally, we have a statutory obligation to protect, maintain, and enhance the estate into perpetuity. So our other stakeholder is future generations, common to all businesses, often neglected, but as I'll come back to, in my opinion, crucial. Simply put, when it comes to purpose, stakeholders play a fundamental role, providing and supporting the platform that enables value creation in all its forms. They are also the beneficiaries of the value that you create. Positive, negative, short-term, long-term, financial, social, and environmental in the way that I define value. Customers provide demand in return for the products they enjoy. Your people provide capabilities and expect to be fairly rewarded to do meaningful work and possibly in the future to be part of governance. And communities and society provide your license to operate, provided that you earn it. What this means is that stakeholders are also essential in helping you define your purpose. That's how you ensure alignment, which will pay dividends as you navigate conflicting demands, seek trust, legitimacy, and also resilience. If there's material asymmetry between your purpose and your stakeholders' primary drivers, then that's a problem. You'll ultimately be unable to achieve the very thing that your purpose empowers you to do. Contradiction and conflict will get in the way. Take the way you attract capital. Your funding should share in your purpose and align with how you create value, as Victoria outlined at the beginning. We all know that systemic misalignment is all too common, driving disproportionately short-term thinking, where immediate returns are prioritised disproportionately over other value drivers. Stakeholder alignment in purpose starts inside the business with the fiduciary duty of the board. The board should ideally endorse a purpose, in my opinion, be duty bound to hold the chief executive and the business to account for its authentic and effective deployment and pursuit. And if financial obligations are treated as separate, different and conflicting duties, the empowering potential of your purpose will ultimately slip through your fingers. And risks may arise as shareholders are forced to rationalise the difference between what it says on your website and how they experience your business in reality. This summit and the work being done at S.p.A Business School on enacting purpose is making important progress on just this, how we enshrine it in corporate governance and reflect it in every aspect of business activity, so it's no longer treated as an adjunct or just a catchy slogan, is fundamental. A moment on purpose, stakeholders and risk. I've had plenty of conversations with people who believe that purpose creates additional risk to manage by opening a business up to criticism it wouldn't otherwise be exposed to. Others see it as a nice to have, and I don't subscribe to either of these positions. I talked about how no business is an island, as Francis did, and this poses a fundamental question in a volatile world as we are. Are you going to bring your business to the world, or will you wait for the world to come to you? I believe stakeholders are catching up, and when rhetoric doesn't meet reality, whether it's employees protesting or voting with their feet and leaving, investment fleeing, or trust in your brand failing. Your decisions, your actions and behaviours are the foundation of trust, and failure to see this misses an opportunity to build legitimacy and with it resilience. A purpose-led strategy compels you as a business to review risks more holistically. This thinking is at the heart of how we're approaching purpose at the Crown Estate, as an opportunity to build a collective legitimacy with ourselves and our stakeholders. Our starting point is the question I touched on earlier, how we can add value to the world based on the uniqueness of our portfolio and our offer. I see the potential as significant with our history, our estate, our capability, and our desire to play our part. By building on the hard work of those that came before us, we can treat and create something very special, something positive and lasting for the nation. Which leaves me with my final remark, and that is returning to arguably the most important stakeholder, future generations. While they don't get to hold us to account today, they are the recipients of what we leave behind. That's why our purpose at the Crown Estate will be guided by the creation of something that ultimately represents them and their interests, to ensure that they are more than mere recipients, but ultimately beneficiaries, inheriting something that will be the foundation of their future, a legacy that they'll be proud of. I strongly suggest we take their role as a stakeholder seriously and as a humble reminder as to why we need to operate with purpose in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks for those views and very clear and detailed overview of the purpose, stakeholder and governance landscape. And we now move on to Jim Snabe. And Jim is chairman of Siemens and also of Mærsk. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Victoria, and thanks for the opportunity. It's been very inspiring to listen to the previous speakers. I think we find ourselves in a very fascinating time in world history, and I remind myself of the fact that in Davos in January, we talked about climate as something it was time to really get our arms around, and there was a strong commitment to stakeholder management. And the last 3 months, since that event, we've been talking about how do we stay healthy and how do we lock down countries in various ways. And so the good news is, if there is any, like Francis said, it's a time to reflect. And I think for me, the COVID-19 is a potential catalyst for change. We've had the issue that the economy is dramatically down. So instead of a 3% growth scenario, we look at a 5% minus potentially. Maybe there's a good news there somewhere that climate, the CO2 emissions have actually gone down by 8%. It's a very expensive way of solving climate change. So I probably need to figure out a better way to do that. But COVID-19 goes actually to the heart of the conversation, and it puts 3 dilemmas in my mind. There is one risk that globalization will reverse, and I think it's the wrong response to the climate, to the situation. Globalization has lifted billions of people out of poverty and created opportunity everywhere. And so we have to be careful we don't reverse that. And instead, we need to build more resilient supply chains. Secondly, of course, there is the issue that, now with all this health focus, do we have capacity to deal with climate? And again, my conclusion is the opposite of the obvious. We need to accelerate. In January, we discussed we must do something, but we don't have the means, the money to do it. Now all the funds are coming in to help recover the economy. So why don't we use them smart and accelerate the pace of our sustainability agenda? And finally, obviously, there is an acceleration of digitization. This event is a good example of that. We've gotten used to digital experiences. The challenge is that we don't use technology in a responsible way today. So as we accelerate digitization, we need to ensure that we do that in a responsible way. I believe we are in a unique moment in history, not because of COVID-19, but because of those 3 very significant changes that are happening at the same time. Climate is a challenge and it needs to get dealt with in an urgent way. Technology is propelling us forward at a pace which we've never seen before. And you could argue that globalization or the geopolitical situation is actually reversing a globalization in some sense. And if we're not careful, we end up in a very suboptimal situation. You cannot deal, in my mind, with global challenges by having national plans. It only works with global cooperation. And I think the uniqueness of this moment, you have all of these changes going on at the same time, is a moment where you need leadership. And for me, leadership starts with purpose. It starts with the understanding why your organization even exists and coming back to that core, and then propel yourself forward. Use the opportunity now to reinvent at an accelerated pace, not return to what we had before, which was clearly not good enough. Now, I operate as a chairman in a 2-tier governance system, and that is a bit different to the Anglo-Saxon model of one board. We have a supervisory board that kind of monitors and advises, a management board or managing board that runs the company. So, as a chairman of 2 of the largest companies in Europe, responsible for more than 450,000 employees around the world, I actually believe that this model is quite unique and very helpful in times of radical change. I often say that management is driving the bus, and the exec or the supervisory board needs to be involved in making sure the GPS is set correctly. And we do try and influence the speed in which the bus is driving as well. However, the question is, of course, what can we do as a board to really accelerate, let's say, or strengthen the idea of a purpose-driven organization? I believe the board has 4 unique tasks. Number 1, we have to ensure that the strategy is correct. We don't develop the strategy, but by having a supervision, we can ask the right questions. And to me, the questions to ask in these kinds of change is, which of the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, do we actually influence? Where's our core, our purpose related to the challenges of the world, so that we ensure that the strategy solves relevant problems? We know those problems. There are 17 of them. They are well defined. We need, of course, as a second priority to select the right leadership, which is probably the most important decision of a supervisory board. And I see an important role there is to promote next generation leadership, not leaders, but leadership based on purpose and multi-stakeholder orientation. We have a third important role, which is defining success. Success for all stakeholders. We tend to be focused on the financial performance of the company, but we need to ensure that we also have the performance related to the other stakeholders, the customers, the employees, as well as the planet. At Siemens, we have in our long-term incentive model, ESG-based components to make sure that management is focused on all of the stakeholders. And finally, of course, we need to ensure that the company is compliant and takes relevant risks. I think in times of radical change, not taking a risk is probably the biggest risk you can take. So it is about taking calculated risks so that you can renew the company in times when you are strong and there's a need for it. I sometimes use the picture of Manhattan to kind of explain this complexity of running the company and reinventing the company. In Manhattan, you have streets and avenues. When you look at the people there, they're busy. They know where they're going. They know where they come from. They typically look at their mobile phones. You go 5 minutes out in the Central Park and you see people holding hands. They don't look at their mobile phones, hopefully. They look at the sky or each other. I'm sure they think bigger thoughts. And so how do we create environments in a boardroom where management is held accountable for delivering on the value for the stakeholders that are relevant, and at the same time allow for the creative moments where human ideas and creativity can form and challenge some of the assumptions? The biggest assumption, and I'll end there, that we need to challenge is the assumption that doing good for business and doing good for society is a trade-off. You have to do one or the other, which is why many companies have been trying to make a good business and then discuss how to use some of their profits in doing good. I think that is tilting, and it's the wrong assumption. I think we need to make money in a way that's good for society. So it's not about how you spend your money when you have made your profits, it's how you make your money. And the inflection point we have right now, the combination of geopolitical global trades that are being challenged, technological advancements that help us solve many of these problems, and a climate that needs attention right now, I think is a unique opportunity. I often say that we are lucky to be leaders in times of radical change, but with that luck comes an enormous obligation to create a better future, and doing that in a way that's good for all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for those. Okay, so we now end our panel presentations with Emma Marcegaglia. I hope I pronounced that right, Emma. So thank you, and over to you. Emma, I think you might be on mute. I certainly can't hear you, whether you're able to.
Could you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Fantastic. If you could
Okay.
start from the beginning, so that your slides. Thank you.
I didn't want to disturb before, so sorry for that. So I was saying that I'm very happy to be part of this prestigious event and also to be part of this very important panel. So let me say that I would like to take the point of my experience from two different important experiences that I had. The first is as chairwoman of ENI, which is one of the most important company in the energy sector in Italy, but also from being the owner and also the CEO of my family company. This is a company in the transformation of steel, and this is a 5 billion euro company. So I would like to take the experience of both of them because they are different from one side, but also very similar from another side. So first of all, let me say that I totally agree on what I have heard up to now. I think you know, the discussion that we are having today and saying in this moment where we have a lot of uncertainty, big challenges, the idea to think about what is our purpose, to work on this, to understand why are we doing our business, what are the values, why we are here. The answer is very clear. We are in business because we want, in a profitable way, in a trade way, as Professor Mayer said before, solve problems of people and of the planet. So I totally agree on this. Of course, we have to do it in the best way possible. We have also to do it thinking about our values, our heritage, where are we coming from. I think we need to do something that is really authentic. We don't have to do something which is just, you know, an image to say, well, I'm fine, I'm very nice because I'm doing this. This has to be a very strong, deep exercise, and it takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of challenge, and it's also a way to, you know, to have a very clear look at on long term what we want to do. So I totally, I've taken part also to your discussion. So I really think that this is one of the key and core things that, you know, a manager, an owner of a company has to think about it in the future. So let me say that, for example, the first example is Eni. So we have worked a lot on this, and for example, we thought, and we still think. Well, now I left some months ago the chairmanship, but I'm still chairman of the foundation of Eni. We thought that our purpose for us was very clear. The purpose for us was to really to be an energy company and to concretely support the just energy transition with the objective of preserving our planet and promoting an efficient and sustainable access to energy. So this is a very strong challenge. Put together the fact that we have really to work for, you know, decarbonization and just transition, but also give access to energy to the people. We still have 1 billion people without access to energy, and if you don't have access to the energy, you cannot have decent life. So we work a lot on this, and then you have also to understand and to execute this. One of the points that you also point out is how you do it. So you have to understand what is your purpose, but then you have to execute your purpose. You have to understand how to do it. And so, for example, we already have done this. So we, for example, we give access to energy to some African countries where we are. We invested in power plant. We invested in grid. We keep the majority, or in some case 100%, for example, of the gas that we discover in those countries. So this is a clear, concrete way to how to give access to energy. On the other side, of course, we are very strongly involved in the just transition. So we are investing a lot, much more in gas and much less in oil. We have a plan to go to 2050 with minus 80% of CO2 emission, with all our products completely decarbonized, and we have a lot of steps that we have to do in 2030, 2040, and 2050. So this is what we are doing. But also you have to measure this. This is another very important point. how you measure this. And you need the kind of standardization on the measurement. Otherwise, everybody's saying, okay, I'm executing my purpose, but if you don't have a clear and a standardized way of measure what you're doing, this is not clear. So we are also working on that. We were part of the TSPD board, and we are already doing our disclosure in line with the TSPD rules. So I think also this point of measurement is very important. From the governance point of view, also here we work a lot. I totally agree with what Jim said. I think in this part, the board has to take a lot of responsibility. We work a lot on this. We create a lot of commission. We had also an advisory board. We, for example, Ms. Figueres and others to work us to understand, to help us to understand what is the real challenge and how to face the challenge of sustainability and energy transition. We also trained ourselves a lot, because I agree with Jim. You need to select your directors in the best way, but also you need to train your board members. So, for example, we were part of this climate governance initiative, where for the board member you share a lot of benchmark, and you share with other boards what is the good way, the best way to face in terms of governance the decision on sustainability and so on and so forth. So and to take responsibility. Let me say one final word on the family-owned company, my own family-owned company. I have to tell you that in my experience, when you talk about a family-owned company, the purpose and the idea to do something to solve the problems of people is really embedded in the family-owned company. The long-term view is probably more clear and easier to get. For example, on this, during the COVID-19, and as you know, Italy has been strongly hit by that, we understood that our people wanted from us to understand how we keep their job, but they wanted also to understand how we could help them, themselves and their family in their health. How could we explain them what was going on? So I think in a moment like that, a company and the family-owned company understood a lot that, your role is very important. And in my opinion, also in the future, the role of leadership, the role of helping the people and solving the problem of the people is really one of the most important. So I really think that, as you said before, we have to work a lot. We still are in the process of a very uncertain situation, but the most important thing is that everybody in the business, all the business people understand that this is really a key role, a key responsibility, and we all have to work to really get a success out of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing those insights from your organization, Emma. That was very insightful. And we will now move directly to the 10-minute Q&A. We might have a couple more minutes than 10, which is fantastic, because we've been receiving many, many interesting questions via the Slido. And just to say, any that aren't answered, please go to the LinkedIn group. They'll be posted there. So please engage in a discussion around those unanswered questions. I'll start with one question per panel member. So a different question for each panel member. And then if we get time for any more, that would be fantastic. So I'd like to start off with a question to Jim. So the question from Tom Wills is, in most cases, prioritizing people and planet will mean fewer profits. This is not a win-win. How can corporate governance enshrine a hierarchy of priority?
So first of all, I need to challenge the assumption that it's not potentially a win-win. When we produce wind turbines and distribution of energy systems and storage systems for energy, at Siemens, we do that which is good for the planet, it's good for employment, and it's good for business. So I think the first thing we need to do is to challenge that assumption that it's either or. That's simply, in my experience, too easy. I give you another example. At Mærsk, we have reduced our CO2 emissions from sailing containers around the world by 42%. And we save money when we use less fuel. We don't spend money. And so the first half of this equation is a positive business case. And we have an obligation to find those opportunities and drive those conversations and challenge those assumptions. Obviously, there are trade-offs to be made. And for instance, when we have employment shifting, we have a strong commitment as a company to redeploy the people we already have, to reskill them. It has to do with the governance model as well. And in Germany, in my supervisory board, we have 10 employee representatives. To the questions earlier, I mean, Francis can probably comment on that. And that creates the right conversation. It's not a one versus the other. It's about how do we create a strong Siemens that allows for employment and reskilling and opening up growth opportunities in areas that create sustainable solutions, and with that drive revenue and profits. So I think that's the key. For me, it's clear that the fossil phase is over. And sometimes I joke by saying, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stone. And the same is true here. If you're the best stone salesperson in town, you will be out of business. So you have to change now. And that's my argument. Yes, you need the trade-offs, but it's always about keeping the company long-term successful, not just short-term. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So yes, that shift from short-term to long-term having such a profound effect on everything in terms of decision-making. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is to Francis. How do you define stakeholder? Does stakeholder encompass shareholder, or just everyone else other than shareholder? I know for me, shareholders are definitely part of a stakeholder group, but Francis, what's your perspective on that? Oh, Francis, you're on mute. Yeah, thank you.
Is that better?
Yes, now we can hear you.
I'm so sorry.
No worries.
I would agree. I mean, I wouldn't get hung up on the semantics here. We're all stakeholders. Although, I mean, I've always argued that workers invest their lives in the success of a company, and so have, a real personal interest in the company's long-term success, because jobs and livelihoods depend on it. Whereas, of course, we have seen this shift, particularly in Britain, towards more short-term shareholding. And that's why we want to kind of think harder about who should have influence at what point. Can I just jump on Jim's question as well? Because I think it's really important that all of our evidence, everything that workers tell us and our polling shows, that increasingly people want to do meaningful work. And again, I referred during the crisis, the appetite there was, not just amongst companies, but amongst the workforce, to produce goods like protective equipment and ventilators that would actually be good for the community, good for society. There was such a commitment to that. But I've seen it in so many other places too, like Royal Mail, where the workforce, through their union, came up with a proposal for a community service, because they want to do more. Everybody understands that under capitalism, firms are going to want to make a buck. They're going to want to make a profit. But I think what people are yearning for is more meaning, that in itself cannot be enough, that people are searching for that bigger purpose, and that having the workforce inside the room somehow is an essential part of the solution to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Francis. And the data certainly backs up also that power of purpose in terms of the meaning that it can provide. And there's a reason it's purpose. because purpose and meaning, meaningful life is a purposeful life. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Frances. So we will now move to the next question. And this question is for you, Dan. I feel like I'm handing out Christmas presents again. This one's for you. What is the appropriate role for boards in the engagement of stakeholders, not including employees? So who should they engage? How should they engage? And why should they engage?
I guess I'll start with a little story on one of the things that's difficult about this medium is that, you know, it's clunky, but one of the most powerful things I've discovered with it is every week I hold a town hall with my staff and with my team, and you get anonymous feedback, anonymous questions, and you really get a window into what people think. And what you realise is that anonymity gives you access to insights and information that in the normal course of being an executive, you just simply don't have access to. And I think what it does is it brings out the lesson that the more diversity you have around you that spreads out and understands your stakeholders and acts as a brain trust to bring information back so that you can be a better business, the most powerful. So I'm certainly not a chief executive that subscribes to, you know, a territorial view of this is management's responsibility and this is the board's responsibility. There is a difference, but I think that difference can be greyed in a lot of areas. And I think boards have a crucial role to help you understand your stakeholders, help you understand and navigate the world that you operate in. And I think as a leader in business, gone are the days where you can even think of having all the answers or knowing how to interpret in isolation like you could 15, 20 years ago. You've got to be humble and you've got to be open to diverse input streams. And I think the board plays a key role. And I'd also go as far as to say that boards do have a role in understanding an internal culture, because again, you can become quite parochial as an executive for a whole host of reasons. You're human, and a board understanding what happens and how a business feels about itself is equally important, because you know, as we know in the area of risk, you can have the best processes in the world, but if your culture doesn't reflect the risk you're trying to manage, it'll kill those. You know, it'll create issues for you anyway. So that's my view on that.
Thank you. Huge amount of rich insights there, including the importance of culture. And I also like that word brain trust, which is the sort of the whole stakeholder system that you can tap into. So yeah, thank you. That's very, very interesting. So Emma, this is your question. Governance seems to be about managing reward, or returns and risk, merely. So where is the attention that should be placed on impact if we are serious about stakeholders? And just to say, that last question that was for you, Dan, that was from Cora Strandberg, and this question is Jyoti Banerjee.
Okay, so thank you. So, well, when you talk about governance, of course, you talk about reward, return, and risk. As you said, as we have said up to now, I think you know, it's not an easy way to put everything. Sometimes it's also important to recognize that you know, you can have even some conflict in some moment of the company, and I think it's important to recognize that, but then to work to try to, you know, to put together everything. I want to tell you that you know, in a business like us, for example, the risk management is very important. So to understand how to you know, to face the risk is very important. You have to work a lot on that. My perspective is also in this moment, in the moment after, you know, the COVID and during the COVID, also a way to face and to manage the risk is also to, you know, to be very flexible and adaptable, much more than in the past. So now, for example, what we have seen is that sometimes you have to, you know, to change completely, you know, the way you act day by day, because, you know, the situation is getting different or worse. But it's very important. So you have to manage the risk, you have to manage the return, You have also to be adaptable and flexible in the short term, but of course you need always to have also a long-term view to understand, as we said before, why are you in business for? What are your values? What are your heritage you want to do? So I really think it's important to work on this. And in terms of governance, as I said before, I think it's very important to have also very trained directors, to work also as a team, to have diversity, as it has been said before. A board and the role of who is in charge for governance is becoming more and more important. But if you don't have a good governance, if you don't have a good team of people working for the long-term value of your company, is really very difficult. So the core of working for a good governance is one of the most important effort on which we have to work.
Sorry, thank you, Emma. So the role of just picking up on that, the point in the question around impact, then is that something in your organization that you place emphasis on in your governance?
So can you say it again, because I was not able to, because that is not very, I don't hear very well. Could you repeat?
Yes, certainly. So in terms of other than risk and return, the focus on impact, is that something that is high on the agenda of governance in your organization? So the impact that your company is having on stakeholders and the broader system? Yeah,
well, the impact is key. So for example, on any, the impact that we had and we have with the stakeholder is assessed continuously. It's very important to understand, for example, if you work in the energy sector, or if you work, for example, on gas and oil, you have to understand what is the impact in terms of course, of sustainability, in terms of environment. As I said before, we decided to invest much less in oil, much more on gas, because the impact there is on environment is much less. But for example, we also decided in African countries where we are very strong to invest a lot in renewables as well. There is a lot to do there, and nothing has been done.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. I just wanted to make sure that bit around impact really came out, and thank you. That was really clear. We've got 2 minutes left, so it'd be fantastic if we could just get a short response on this question, Colin, before I wrap up. And the question was from Dr. Sue Halliday, that the key issue is that of shareholder primacy. It's been shown by share buybacks and now bailouts. We need a parallel conversation about the purpose of investment capital, don't we? So should we redefine fiduciary duty, e.g. to include protection of social and ecosystems?
There is a strong case to be said that in due course we're going to have to look at corporate law and the way in which we formulate corporate law going forward in terms of the fiduciary responsibilities of directors. But I think it's important to recognize that there's a great deal that can be done under the current system. And so that addressing a lot of these issues that we've discussed today is something that is very much in the power of boards to do. And I think what we're all doing is urging them to take up that challenge. And just before I finish, I'll just say that I will have a brief 10-minute session after this closes to try and answer some of the questions that we've been unable to answer. So if some people want to stay on for that, they're welcome to do so.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you for that. So that brings our session to a close. As I mentioned, all unanswered questions will be posted in the LinkedIn group. So please be engaged in the discussions there, share your thoughts. As you probably know, the next session will take place later today. So that's today at 1700 British Summer Time. Just return to this webpage to join. So I'd just like to end by passing on a sincere thanks to the speakers for their time and their honest and open insights. I think you'll all agree it was a very enriching and interesting session. Also, thanks to the team that made this event possible, the technicians, the scribe, the British Academy of Staff, and anyone else that I have not mentioned. And finally, thank you to all you, the audience, over 1,000 of you, for making this event something that has the potential to shift governance and the world. Thank you very much. So should I?
Hello, welcome back. And this is a session which I will attempt to answer some of the questions that have been raised. I'll start off with one that is about engaging with stakeholders, which a number of you asked about. How can one engage around purpose with stakeholders? How can companies best share their purpose with their external stakeholders, etc. Now that's an absolutely key element in terms of getting honest feedback from stakeholders. The traditional way in terms of whistleblowing is clearly not sufficient. It might be important, but it's not adequate. And so there are a variety of mechanisms which are beginning to emerge in terms of forms of participation through using apps, through social media, by which people can express their views anonymously in an honest form. It's being used in a number of organizations, in particular to get feedback from employees about whether or not they feel that the management is living up to what they're saying about their corporate purpose. And that is very important to give people a sense that they can make their views known, and also to allow boards and directors to hear what is going on and what people really think. Now that can be extended to other stakeholders, for example, to customers. There's a question about employee representation on boards. Why not take a step further and embrace representation of all stakeholders? And that does raise a question about to what extent can one get a really representative view of stakeholder interests, and what's the best way of achieving that? Now, there are a number of ideas that are emerging in that regard, to have, for example, forums or councils. There's always then a question about who sits on those, how they're elected, etc. For a large multinational corporation, it becomes really quite complex to get a truly representative view. One thing that has emerged in the political sphere, which is an interesting approach, is in terms of citizen assemblies, where essentially people are elected on a random basis from particular groups. And that may be a mechanism by which that type of interaction can be achieved. But I think one of the messages that comes across from today and a lot of discussions in this area is the importance that the board recognizes that it is there with an objective of representing the interests of all parties. Of course, there is a duty to the shareholders, but there's a duty in terms of discharging that duty to shareholders to all stakeholders in a company. And that then shifts the nature of the debate. And Jim Snabe really made the point that two-tier board, as in Germany, might be quite a helpful way of trying to achieve that. There's a question about US tech giants and being very purpose-focused. I might leave that for a bit later on, because if you join in our session this afternoon, it will be very much focused on tech companies. One person says that they see too many leaders making decisions based on personal and shareholder gain. How can we begin to get these leaders to see value in purpose? Now, that's a question that a lot of people raise about how are we going to bring about real substantial change in companies that don't have the same sort of commitment that we've heard from the panelists today. And in essence, as was said, the fact that this crisis has created such a shift in attitude is, I think, indicative of one way in which that change is taking place. And indeed, it was Milton Friedman who said that only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And the question that I see ourselves as facing is, can we bring about the necessary adoption of purpose in all companies without having to encounter a series of crises? And to do that, I think it's debates like this, it's views being expressed by people that this is what they expect of companies, and that the old notion of business, of it being there simply to reflect the interest of shareholders and the profitability of firms, is no longer adequate for business in the 21st century. Does the adoption of a long-term purpose actually improve the perception and management of risk, thus potentially improving long-term profitability? The answer is yes, certainly to a large extent. A long-term focus for a company does make a board appreciate the potential risks that they might encounter. So, for example, if one thinks about the environmental risks and climate change, then one really has to be thinking in intergenerational terms. So when one talks about long-term purpose, it's important to recognize that that is more than just thinking about the discounted value of the future. It's about thinking about the purpose of a company from the perspective of future generations. And if one does that, then that automatically drives companies to reflect much more on the risks that they might encounter and the failures that might emerge before they're able to get to those future generations. I think at this particular point, I probably should draw it to a close. There are quite a number of other questions that I haven't been able to tackle, but I hope it gives you a flavor of some of the very rich questions that have come in, and we'll certainly do our best to address as many of the other questions as we can. So thank you very much indeed for joining.